Hey people, it's Nias talking. I saw this on a page. I can't remember which one, but this is the source I'm using, Johnson and Johnson, or you could just put in the Black Angels, Johnson and Johnson. So here it goes: the Black Angels, celebrating Black nursing history. Nurses of color have played a crucial role in shaping the profession's history. Yet for too long, many of nursing's most powerful stories have been untold. Through efforts to dismantle racism within the profession, these untold stories are beginning to emerge, including the story of the Black Angels, whose tireless efforts led to a cure for tuberculosis. For its 100th episode, the See You Now podcast attended DNP's of Color Conference in Washington, D.C. to highlight a powerful conversation with Virginia Allen, LPN, the last known living Black Angel. Celebrate Black History Month with the trailblazing story of Allen and the nurses whose dedication helped to cure one of the most fatal diseases of the 19th century. From Mary Eliza Mahoney, the first Black woman to work as a licensed nurse, to Sandra Lindsay, RN, the first person in the U.S. to receive a you-know-what vax outside of clinical trials, nurses of color have played an integral role in the profession's history. Yet for too long, discrimination and racism have erased many of nursing's most powerful stories. Despite oppression and prejudice, the work of Black nurses has led to some of medicine's greatest advances, and their tenacity, empathy, and commitment to proactively transform healthcare and change patients' lives have defined the spirit of the profession. Now, through efforts to dismantle racism within the profession, these stories are being acknowledged, shared widely, and celebrated, including the stories of the Black Angels. To help share this groundbreaking story, the See You Now podcast attended the DNP's of Color Conference in Washington, D.C. to highlight a powerful conversation among Virginia Allen, LPN, the last known living Black Angel, Maria Smilios. Yes, I think that was the page. Maria Smilios on Instagram, author of the new book, The Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. So if you want to find out more about this story, that's the one you go to. Maria Smilios, The Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. Nurses You Should Know creators Joanna Seltzer, Uribe, and Ravenna Aponte recorded live. This 100th episode of the podcast shows how Allen perfectly embodies the trailblazing, change-making pioneer spirit of See You Now and the nursing profession. Who were the Black Angels? More than 300 courageous Black nurses uprooted their lives in the Jim Crow South to seek economic opportunity as nurses caring for tuberculosis patients at Seaview Hospital in New York from 1928 to 1960. Others refused to help, fearing spread of the disease, but these exceptional women, including Virginia Allen, stepped forward and risked their lives amid racism and poor working conditions to care for the city's poorest residents. In doing so, they contributed to a breakthrough TB treatment, and their dedication and commitment to their critically ill patients earned these nurses as the title of the Black Angels. I want to just stop right here. So these nurses were put in harm's way because others wouldn't do a job, and that these were the only jobs they could get. Well, this is part of the thing. I want to point this out. There are many Black people who probably were forced into doing jobs that they didn't want, or doing them in a way that was more unsafe than they had to be, and probably resulted in death and injury that they didn't have to, simply because they were Black and seen as expendable and not given the proper safety gear or training. This is another aspect of reparations that is ignored. All the Black people who have died and suffered because they were forced into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise have chosen to do if they had any choice in the matter. The Black Angels' impact on finding the tuberculosis cure. In her book, author Maria Smilios captures an oral history of the nurses at Seaview Hospital, a public facility built specifically to care for those with tuberculosis, and the role they played in the drug trials for the antibiotic isoniazid, which helped lead to a cure for the devastating disease. Meanwhile, people will say Black people have contributed nothing, and then ignore stories like this. Then known as the White Plague, tuberculosis was a painful, debilitating, contagious disease responsible for nearly 18% of New York City deaths in the early 1900s. It killed 1 out of every 7 people in both the United States and Europe, primarily affecting working-class citizens. Smilios describes the suffering and bleak conditions the Black Angels faced when they arrived at New York's largest municipal sanitarium in 1929. Hundreds of patients lay in iron-framed beds, languishing, wrote Smilios. They sweated and groaned and cried out. They coughed and choked and spit up blood, with each cough sending swarms of live germs into every room and every corner of the ward. And I want to also take a moment to say this. I remember seeing a post online which it said that the only reason universal healthcare isn't a thing is because whites and the public don't want black people to receive healthcare as well. The same way in the old days, people had no problem with welfare until black people received it. Then suddenly you hear about welfare queens and people being lazy. Here's another thing about reparations. How many black people die as a result of not being able to access healthcare because of this whole racist policy of, well, we don't want universal healthcare because we don't want blacks to have it. Yet again, we have to bring this up. Let's keep going. Historically, the nurses at Seaview has been predominantly white, but by this time, many refused to treat tuberculosis patients and walked out en masse. Desperate to avert a public health crisis, city officials recruited black nurses from the South. For them, it was the first opportunity to work in a non-segregated environment that did not discriminate through intentional exclusion in hiring or hospital quotas. At any time, a nurse could be responsible for 20 patients each and could take 3 hours to take care of one person. Virginia Allen arrived at Seaview from Detroit in 1947 when she was just 16 years old. With no prior work and very little life experience, she came to New York during a time of great economic potential and innovations in medicine. Antibiotics were a new phenomenon. A new nurse shortage had the nation on the precipice of a public health crisis. Allen became one of hundreds recruited to fill the ranks at Seaview. She stayed for over a decade caring for tuberculosis patients until a cure was developed in 1951. There she witnessed and supported the isoniazid drug trials as physicians raced for a cure. Isoniazid was one of 4 frontline drugs that produced remarkable results in tuberculosis patients on the brink of death. An alien patient could suddenly get out of bed, walk, and talk. The Black Angels administered the isoniazid to patients, took their vitals, and evaluated them. All essentials to the success of the drug trials. The people at the front of these trials are the nurses, Smilio said. They knew the disease better than anybody. The nurses had been working there for decades. They knew how tuberculosis ebbed and flowed. They knew its nuances. They knew how the microbe was arrogant and wily and how it could lay low. One morning somebody could wake up feeling okay, and in the afternoon they'd be hemorrhaging. The nurses could pick up intonations in the voice that would signal to them something is wrong. At the DNP of Color conference, Allen says she feels very privileged to represent the Black Angels. It's important to remember they would be very pleased knowing they are appreciated and their work is remembered. The doctor received a lot of recognition, but the nurses were overlooked, she said. The legacy of the Black Angels extends beyond the cure for tuberculosis. As Smilios writes, the work they did at Seaview informed their fight against systemic and institutional racism. At that time, they were barred from joining professional nursing organizations. The nurses who worked in the tuberculosis wards played an important role in pushing the American Nurses Association to admit black nurses. The Black Angels played an important role in helping to desegregate New York City hospitals. And I want you to see that word they just said, desegregate. That meant that there was segregation in New York City hospitals. Keep in mind, they keep saying that segregation didn't happen anywhere else. At the time, black nurses were only permitted to work at 4 of the 26 facilities within the Department of Hospitals. Their exclusion eventually led to the formation of the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, which elevated Seaview nurses into well-deserved leadership positions and prepared them for the impending civil rights movement. Allen describes meeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was very, very supportive of us. Every year he would come and speak, and we called it a day of solidarity. Virginia is really a trailblazer as she represents the relentless courage of a generation of nurses who carved out the space, sometimes at their own expense of their safety and well-being, for the next generation of nurses and to provide the care for those who were neglected, said Joanna Seltzer-Uribe, co-founder of Nurses You Should Know. In the See You Now episode, Smilios describes the honor and privilege of telling the Black Angels story. It's not just a story of nursing, it's a story of resilience. It's a story of medicine, she said. This is ultimately a story of triumph and hope. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. That source was Nursing Johnson & Johnson. And the book was Maria Smilios, author of Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. I hope you enjoyed this. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.